Well, as mentioned, we're going to be spending a lot of time in the book of 1 John this week, which I'm very excited about. We're going to be reading it together, studying it together, memorizing it together, which I think is pretty great that we're going to be putting God's word into our hearts through memorization. And we're going to hopefully be putting his word into practice. That's what we want to do this week, is not just understand it better, but really live it out, put it into practice in our lives. Now, we talk about 1 John, and we use the word book, the book of 1 John, and we talk about a lot of the books of the Bible that way, but probably a better word to describe 1 John and many of the books of the Bible would be as a letter, because that's really what it is, and you need to understand it that way, that 1 John was a letter written by the Apostle John in his old age, one of the closest friends of Jesus, spent time with Jesus, lived a long life where all the other disciples died a martyr's death. John lived into his old age, and he sits down and he writes this letter to the churches that he dearly loves. It's a letter from John to these people that he loves. Now, handwritten letters, that's a rare thing today, right? How many of you, by show of hands, have a grandmother who still writes you handwritten notes or letters? Anybody have that grandmother? That's great. Well, I had a grandmother like that. She would write me handwritten letters, and she would put it in the mail, and she would always put a few dollars in there. Do you get that as well? A few dollars. And she would always put a stamp in the letter, right, in the envelope. And it was a clear indication that she expected me to write her back, right? Handwritten letters are a special thing. I came across a handful of letters written by kids to various people. For example, here's an apology letter of sorts. Dear Brody, Miss P made me write you this note. All I want to say sorry for is not being sorry, because I tried to feel sorry, but I don't. Liam. Right, it was Father's Day this past Sunday. Well, maybe this is a Mother's Day note. Mommy, I love you. Sometimes. Honest, right? The honest approach. All right, do you remember this letter when you were in grade school or junior high school? I like you, do you like me? Yes, no, maybe. You remember that, right? All right, maybe you're still doing that, right? So here's one of those letters. Dear Ashley, would you please be my girlfriend? I like you a lot. Yes, no, maybe. P.S. Please put yes, no, or maybe. Right? So she writes back, right? She responds on the same note. I'm sorry. I already have a boyfriend, Kyle. But when we break up, you're my next choice. P.S. That'll probably be a month or two, just so you know. That's great. All right, sometimes we write letters to God. Here's a child who wrote a letter to God. Dear God, thank you for the baby brother. But what I prayed for was a puppy, Joyce. To the Tooth Fairy, dear Tooth Fairy, I lost my tooth on the 23rd of October. Now it is November 12. I lost my tooth in pizza. I lost both today. You owe me $1. Not to be hard, but I need money. And this, oh boy. Here's the last one. Dear Mom, thank you so much for being my mom. If I had a different mom, I would punch her in the face and go find you. Love, Brooke. That's great. Handwritten letters, right? They're a special thing that have emotional impact to them. In fact, this week, a little challenge, practical challenge, you should write somebody a handwritten letter just in honor of 1 John. Somebody in your youth group, somebody back home, just sit down, write a handwritten note to somebody. It would mean a lot to them. And as entertaining as those letters are, you receive letters sometimes that really mean something to you, that you carry around with you. About 6 years ago, my mother passed away from breast cancer, and so I was at her home with my two younger sisters, and we were in her bedroom going through her closet trying to figure out what to do with her stuff. And as we were doing that, we came upon a shoebox, and in that shoebox there were a bunch of pictures, and we were looking through those pictures just laughing, and there were pictures of us when we were kids and we were teenagers, and tucked away in those pictures was an envelope with my name on it. And inside that envelope was a letter written by my mother to me around my graduation, high school graduation time. For whatever reason, she wrote this letter, folded it up, put it in the envelope, tucked it away, and she forgot about it, and she never gave it to me. And I read it for the first time 15 years after she wrote it, shortly after she passed away. Certainly a meaningful letter. Well, this is a letter. And in this letter, there is this really great theme that we're dealing with today, this contrast between light and darkness. And that's what we want to talk about today, contrasting the light from the darkness. We see it in two different places. We see it in chapter 1, and we also see it in chapter 2. Here it is in chapter 1, starting in verse 5. This is the message we heard from Jesus and now declare to you. God is light. God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all. So we are lying if we say that we have fellowship with God, but go on living in spiritual darkness. We are not practicing the truth. If we are living in the light as God is in the light, then we have fellowship with each other, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. Now, what John is telling us right away is that you can't live in both worlds. Either you're walking in the light or you're walking in the darkness. You can't have a foot in both worlds. That's that walking imagery. Either your feet are firmly planted in the light or your feet are firmly planted in the darkness. And so the question that we're confronted with is, how are you living right now? Are you living in the light, or are you walking in the darkness? So I want you to do something. I want you to get out a piece of paper, a notebook, a journal, anything that you have in front of you, and I want you to do something for me. On that piece of paper, I want you to draw a circle, right? Not a very big circle, 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Just draw yourself a circle there on that piece of paper. And I want you to just take some time right now, just take a moment, and I want you to evaluate your life. I want you to think about the choices that you're making, kind of where you are in your heart and in your mind, in your choices. And I want you to draw an X. Now that circle right there represents the circle that this light here on stage is creating. There's a circle of light here on the stage, and this circle of light represents the light that John is talking about here in the first chapter, and we'll see it again in the second chapter. So that's what that circle represents, the light of God, the will of God in your life. Where are you in relationship to this light? Just draw an X where you think you are right now on this day. Are you right in the middle of the light? Are you securely walking in the light, living with God, loving him, loving others? Are you right in the middle of the light? Or maybe you're somewhere on the edge of that circle, like you're still in the light, but you feel yourself drifting away, if you're just being honest with yourself. Or maybe some of you are on the outside of the light, looking in. Like you know people who are living in the light, and you love them and you appreciate them and you're curious and you're interested, but you've yet to make that decision to step securely into the light, and that's just where you are today. Or maybe some of you are way out here in the darkness. For whatever reason, you are far from God. There's doubt, there's skepticism, there's fear in your heart, you're living in disobedience, and this is where you would place yourself. Just where are you right now in your life? Define reality for yourself. Are you living in the light? Now, sometimes it's hard to know, isn't it? Like maybe right now you put the X on that circle and you knew right away where you stood, where you stand with God. But some of you maybe are wrestling with it and you're not sure. It's hard to know sometimes. And that's what John's audience, that's what they were dealing with. They were dealing with confusion because there were people who were living outside of the light, false teachers who were living outside of the light, who were attempting to confuse them, who were saying that Jesus isn't enough, that you need Jesus plus you need more, and you need this and you need that. And they were wondering, how can we really know whether or not we're living in the light? And that's the question that John wants to address throughout the entirety of this letter. You can know that you're living in the light, and there's a very simple way to determine the answer to that question. He answers that question with 3 clear answers. 3 answers that are woven throughout the letter. 3 ways that you can know that you're living in the light, and here they are. You can believe in Jesus, you can obey his commands, and you can love one another. How can you know that you're living in the light? Believe in Jesus, obey his commands, and love one another. Now I want you to go ahead and say those 3 words with me this morning. How can you know that you're living in the light? First of all, believe in Jesus, obey his commands, love one another. Let's say those three words together again. Believe. Let's just say the words, right? Ready? Believe, obey, love. Right? Let's do it one more time. Ready? Believe, obey, love. I want those three words to really sink in to your mind and heart, because that's the heart of 1 John. Believe in Jesus, obey his commands, love one another. Now we're going to talk about the third answer that John gives in this letter. We're going to talk about the way of love. And here's my bottom line. You know that you're living in the light if you love one another. You know that you're living in the light if you love one another. Listen to how John describes the necessity of our love for one another. 1 John chapter 2, verses 7 through 11. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one which you have had since the very beginning. The old command is the message you have heard, yet I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Now you can see in these opening verses here that there's a contrast here between the old command and the new command, but they're actually the same command. It's kind of confusing. John is saying that this old command to love one another, it goes all the way back to the law of Moses, to the teaching of Jesus. John himself even wrote about the command to love one another in his gospel. But it's a new command. It's new because of Jesus. Jesus makes it new for us. Each and every day, there's a new emphasis in our life to love one another, a new expression of our love for one another. It's an old command, but it's a new command. It's echoes of John 13:34. Jesus said, this new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you ought to love one another. And then the contrasts continue in verse 9. He says, anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. And anyone who loves their brother or sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. Love and hate, light and darkness, a new command, an old command. How can you know that you're living in the light? How can you know that you're right here at the center of God's will? At least one answer that's given in this letter is this. You know you're living in the light if you are loving one another. So I want you to look at your circle again, where you placed your X. Now, based upon how you're loving those around you, just see, based on that idea alone, right? Just kind of remove everything else, all other thoughts, all other indicators, just based upon your interaction with other people, the way you talk to and about others, the way you treat others, people that you know, people that you don't know, people that you like, people that you don't like. Based on your love for others, where would you place yourself? Would the X move slightly closer to the light or further away from the light? Because you can only live in the light if you are loving one another. A couple of weeks ago, I heard one of my friends, Michael DeFazio, who teaches at Ozark Christian College, told this great story of this German Christian named Dirk, who lived a couple hundred years ago in a place and during a time when Christianity was illegal, and he was in his home, and the soldiers came to arrest him, and he ran out the back door, and he started running through the woods away from the soldier, running as fast as he could through the woods. The branches were scratching his arms and his legs. He came upon this frozen lake, and without hesitation, he ran across the frozen lake to the other side to safety, and all of a sudden he realized that the soldier was no longer chasing him. He turned around, and he could see that the soldier had plummeted into the ice. And in that moment, Dirk had a decision to make. Would he continue to run and preserve his life, continue to run towards safety, or would he turn around and help this soldier who was seeking to arrest him? And in that moment of decision, it's as if he heard Jesus say to him, "Don't forget what I did for you." And so Dirk went back out onto that frozen lake, and he lifted that soldier to safety, the same soldier who would oversee his execution just 48 hours later. Now that's love, right? And we hear a story like that and we think, oh wow, I hope I have the courage, I hope I have the bravery to love somebody in that same situation. And it's oftentimes easy for us to think about our love for others in these big, grand schemes and ideas. When we think about mission trips that we go on, or when we think about coming to CIY Move, it's easy to love one another in those contexts. But the love that we are to have for one another in order to live in the light is a love that should be expressed in our everyday actions, everyday things, the small things that we do. Would you agree with me that this world needs people who love one another just a little bit more? But not a love that is superficial, not a love that is only seen by other people, but a love that is displayed in sacrificial ways, in unseen ways, in everyday sort of ways, in small ways. The way you talk to and about one another, including what you post on social media. How you treat that student who needs a friend more than you. The way you respect the opposite sex. How you talk to your parents and how you treat your siblings. Your willingness even to obey the rules is an expression of love for others. How you treat other people in your life. All of these are ways that we can love one another and live in the light. Are you loving others the way Jesus loves you? Now, I mentioned earlier that I live currently in Missouri, but I actually grew up in South Carolina. Do we have anybody here from South Carolina? That's what I thought, right? Myrtle Beach, South Carolina is where I grew up. That's my hometown. It's where I graduated high school. I love living on the beach. A lot of advantages to living on the beach. There are some disadvantages, however. One of those disadvantages would be dealing with hurricanes. And so I remember as a kid and as a teenager having to deal with hurricanes. So it was with great interest whenever there were two major hurricanes. Do you remember this? A couple years ago, two major hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. They were back-to-back hurricanes that hit the coast of Florida and Houston. Major hurricanes, millions of dollars in damage, lives lost. Well, recently, I heard of a young couple who've been married for 75 years. 75 years of marriage. Recently, he turned 104. She will turn 93 this November. Their names, Harvey and Irma. Can't make this stuff up. Now, if Harvey and Irma were here after 75 years of marriage and 100 years of life, I think they would remind us to make our relationships a priority, to take care of the people we love, and to let other people take care of us. They would remind us to be kind to strangers, to forgive quicker than we would normally forgive, to speak words that build others up, to look for opportunities to love others. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but let us encourage one another, especially now that the day of his return is drawing near. That's the challenge for the day. Let us think of ways, let us create ways, let us come up with ways that we can motivate one another, that we can spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us be that kind of person. Let us be that kind of people, thinking of ways to demonstrate love, because that's what it means to live in the light. The story is told that the Apostle John, when he was very old, would be carried around by his disciples from church to church. And whenever they would take him to a church in his old age, he would muster up the strength to deliver one message. He would say to the church, brothers and sisters, little children, dear friends, love one another. And then they would take him to the next church, and he would muster up the strength to say the same words, dear friends, dear children, love one another. And his disciples would carry him to the next church and the next church after that. And in his old, feeble state, he would deliver the same message. Dear children, love one another. His disciples became annoyed by this. Finally, they said, teacher, why do you always say this? Why do you keep repeating the same message? His reply, because it is the Lord's commandment. And if it alone is kept, it is sufficient. My son is a cross-country runner. Do we have any distance runners here? Yeah. I love cross-country meets. Very encouraging environment. If you've never been to a cross-country meet, I encourage you to do it sometime. Very encouraging environment. People are cheering on the last place runner just as loudly as they're cheering on the first place runner. It's really a great experience. Well, I remember watching a meet at the beginning of the season. It was a girls' JV race, and it was hot outside, and they weren't in great shape, and they were struggling. It was towards the end of the race, and there was only about a half a mile left, and this poor little junior high girl is just barely running. She's just stumbling forward. She's just in excruciating pain. I'm sure she's thinking, why am I doing this? I hate my life right now. She's stumbling along, and one of her teammates cheers out, "You're doing great. Keep it up. I'll meet you at the finish line." To which this runner, bless her heart, in the middle of the race replied, "Okay, sounds great. I was starting to think there wasn't one." That's who we want to be for one another. We want to be a people, a community that gives each other hope whenever we want to give up, whenever we can't see the finish line, whenever we're struggling. You need that encouragement. I need that encouragement. We need to love one another. That's what it means to live in the light. It means we're loving each other, giving life to one another. I'll finish with this. I was watching a sermon, and in that sermon I learned about a guy named Don Ritchie. Don was an Australian who lived for 50 years on a cliff in Sydney, Australia. Now, many would say, based upon this picture, that this is one of the most beautiful views of the Sydney Harbor, this beautiful location. But many would say that this particular spot was one of the worst pieces of real estate in the world. And the reason why is because, on average, one person a day goes to this spot to commit suicide. But for 50 years, Don Ritchie would sit at his sliding glass door on his back porch with binoculars. And anytime he saw someone pull up by foot, by car, by bike, he would make a beeline to them. And he'd smile, and he'd invite them into his home. And they'd drink coffee together, and they'd share a meal with one another, have a conversation, build community, sit at the table together. Now, what's ironic is that Don's occupation for 40 years was selling life insurance. Officially, he's credited with rescuing 160 people from suicide. Unofficially, his family says that the number is closer to 500. In an interview following his retirement, he said, "I'm no longer selling insurance. I'm just selling life." Amen. Today, every day, let's give each other life as he has given us life. Let's live in the light as he is in the light. Let us love one another as he has loved us.